Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Welcome to this TDI Sustainability and Asian Development Bank webinar on landscape scale ESG management approaches in mining ESG safeguards and the spatial economy. I'm Ashton Stewart Carter. I'm the Executive Chair at TDI Sustainability and your facilitator for today. So today's session explores a tension in opinions and how mining impacts are managed. Maybe actually it's a fault line. There are quite strong opinions, and whose opinion perseveres will result in significant consequences. Go back 25 years, most environmental and social safeguards were designed for and at the project level. They focused on risks and impacts within or in the immediate area around a mine site. I think of it like having your back to the fence and you're looking inwards. The fence is not only your physical boundary, but it's also your management and conceptual boundary. It defines your areas of management interest, to use a bit of management jargon. If you're a mine manager, that's your focus, or at least it used to be. Because the effects of industrial mining, both positive and negative, aren't confined to the mining site itself. Mining results in infrastructure-led transformation in an area. It catalyzes economic interest in one area and potential displacement in another. People move to, settle, or are moved and resettled. Physically, whole mountains and ranges can be changed, not only altering morphology of an area, but also the ecological functioning. If it's a big enough economic ecosystem, mineral development can reshape entire regions, not infrequently in places with weak governance and limited planning capacity. So in this session today, we're going to explore the role that industrial mining should play in this landscape scale economic development. What is the responsibility of mining and mining companies, and also the how-to. How can it be built into large-scale mining project architecture, management, and partnership? How can this approach be integrated? We will discuss if and how ESG safeguards accommodate a landscape approach to environmental and social governance, and what practices can be designed to address the cumulative impacts of that development across an area that is far larger than a single hole in the ground. So this is about moving from compliance at the project level to transformation at the regional level, and asking what kind of safeguards, tools, and institutions and partnerships are needed to make that shift work. So personally, this is a very exciting topic for me. I've spent nearly 10 years working in mining and conservation and advocating for landscape level approaches at mining projects. And then another 10 figuring out how and implementing projects to show that mining companies can work outside the fence and stimulate and support local economies. I can attest that it's tough. It's not straightforward at all. But my working hypothesis is that it is possible, however, and it is an imperative for the mine of the future, something that we'll talk about today. I know that our panelists too are also passionate about this topic and bring a vast experience and knowledge, which I'll try and tease out during our time together. So let me start by quickly introducing our guests. So I'm pleased to be joined by Peter Austin. Peter has more than 40 years professional experience in regional development and planning, strategies of project-induced migration, and embedding regional-level sustainable development principles in large-scale mining, oil and gas infrastructure projects in emerging markets. His extensive global experience in directing large projects, particularly regional planning and feasibility studies, with broad areas of influence examining complex environmental and social interactions between multiple projects, governments and stakeholders, in particular project-induced migration. I'm also joined by Sally Johnson, who has 30 years of experience working for governments, multilateral financial institutions, the private sector, and NGOs. Her areas of expertise include biodiversity due diligence and training, critical habitat assessments, ecosystem services reviews, biodiversity offsets, policy and strategy, strategic and cumulative environmental and social assessments, and project-specific biodiversity impact assessments. Sally has also written many guidance relating to biodiversity, including recently being responsible for writing ICMM's, the International Council for Mining Metals, good practice guidance on mining and biodiversity, which she'll touch on today. And we also have a new speaker, Richard Sherrington, who kindly agreed to replace the advertised participation of Claire Aliden, who was unable last minute to join us, to represent the Asian Development Bank, which is a principal social safeguards specialist where he has worked for the past 6 years. His role includes guiding complex and high-risk transactions through the deal appraisal, monitoring, and project review processes, working on all types of financing modalities and sectors across all geographies of ADB's membership country portfolio. Before joining ADB, Richard worked on the ground as a sustainability leader for global extractive sector companies with exploration and operational activities, principally in Africa, but also across South America, Eastern Europe, and Central and Southern Asia. So we have vast experience on the panel today and representation to discuss mining and the spatial economy from the perspectives of environment and nature conservation, both perspective of social and economic activities, and the governance in investment in private sector financing. So welcome to all. So the agenda for the next hour, on the screen you'll see the agenda for today's session. So we'll start with a brief framing so I can hopefully accelerate straight into our responses from our panel, and followed by this panel discussion with our speakers, and then we'll end with a Q&A session where we'll put your questions to the panelists. So please, audience, keep questions coming in throughout the session using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Thank you too for those who already submitted questions when registering for today's session, and we'll try and incorporate those, and we'll collate these questions as we go along. So that's the next hour. I'm going to start now with a brief framing. Hopefully that'll enable us to get straight into the matter at hand with our panelist. So, what is landscape scale development in the context of mining? Well, I think there's different ways to look at it. The landscape approach, first of all, is large, it's holistic, and it's multidisciplinary in that it seeks to address the needs of an entire area rather than implementing one program focused on a single mine project or one aspect of that mine project. It's also the extent of the mineral landscape is larger than just a mine's operations or its concession because it stretches to the ecological and the economic systems surrounding communities, in the surrounding communities. I would say, and Peter might not agree with me when he comes to talk about this, this is both the directly impacted and indirectly affected communities. And the minerals landscape approach aims to leverage the efforts already existing in a particular area. So it doesn't try and invent, it looks first at what's there and to multiply the positive results through strategic alliances and investment interaction. So when we talk about the approach practically, what does it cover? Well, promoting participatory process of local actors. That's the same as many other projects. It fosters economic diversification in the defined landscape, also similar to some other projects, but the scale and scope is different. It considers the environmental impacts at the very large landscape scale. It looks at the ecological functioning, it looks at the water catchment and sustainable water levels, for example, migration patterns, species range, and so on. And it is integrated, i.e., it is about all aspects of life in that landscape. So it's a combination of natural resource management with environmental and livelihood development. So some of the principles which I think are important to consider, and again, I think we will hear whether our panelists agree or disagree with this. First, it's the scope of sustainable development program is considered in the context of a system. We're looking at a system here, not a point in a landscape. It's not an element of a subunit of that system. So this, to me, this is key. And I look forward to hearing what our panelists say, but I try and persuade people by saying that don't think this as a mining project that you're looking at. Think of it as a mineral development program in the context of sustainable economic development. Don't see it as the mines being at the center and everyone else being their stakeholder, but rather that the mineral deposit is the thing at the center and the mining company, the mining developer is one of the many stakeholders around that thing. Now that view changes things because it looks differently. You look differently then at the responsibilities of the different actors. You look differently at what partnerships are possible and what are the expectations. So we'll be discussing that. Another principle I think is that it's multi-party. The approach logic is based on a comprehensive landscape-wide integrated set of development activities executed by many actors, not just one, to address the needs of the population. And of course, these different actors will have different agendas and goals, whether that's an environmental one, or whether that's a disaster and risk management one, or whether that's a social economic one. And that's going to require a multidisciplinary approach. So we're going to have different skill sets in here as well, which means you're going to have a larger team. And we'll hear a little bit about that today as well, I hope, on how these things are actually implemented. And then the governance of a landscape, to me, the most difficult thing is the governance. That has to be constructed around public-private partnerships, including and especially, of course, with government, which might or might not be present in the area of a mine. And that over time develop a shared vision for what the end goals are of this landscape. And then I think finally, and equally important, but very interesting in my mind, is the development impact in the landscape is delivered through a portfolio of development projects, again, not just for single mine and their activities, that are designed to meet the specific needs in that landscape. So this can range from non-profit capacity development activities to impact investment and micro enterprises and a larger scale capital allocation. So I think what I've done is what my PhD supervisor used to call problematizing the issue, and I've thrown out a lot of potential problems to solve. But luckily, we have the solution providers on the panel with us right here. So let's get down to it and hear from them. So to get the discussion moving, Richard, I hope I can turn to you first. And maybe just ground us in the approach of ADB. Why is mining any different from other sectors that you look at? In your introduction, I noted that you work across all the sectors in the ADB. Is mining a special case?
Yeah, good morning, Ashton. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, I've been looking forward to this conversation, although as you noted, coming in at relatively late notice, but you know, that doesn't detract from the knowledge that we can share and discuss, bearing in mind the experience that I've had directly in mining operations, but also more generally in the extractive sector. So, but I just do want to contextualize this input from ADB by first of all stressing ADB's engagement with mining, or re-engagement with mining, comes in the context of currently a relatively limited experience. So while this is an important subject for us, it also comes, as I say, in the context of a limited exposure to mining. I mean, we have process mining projects previously, but you know, it's some hiatus for us to start re-engaging in this particular space. But it comes at an important time for us because obviously for those of you that know the Asian Development Bank, we've been operating for over 60 years across Asia and the Pacific. And over those 60 years, we've engaged with quite significant high impact infrastructure projects, both within nations, both nationally, both regionally, but also transboundary projects, where there are international infrastructure projects. And some of those do have, you know, significant environmental and social impacts. And we've developed a lot of the environmental and social resources to help guide clients and ADB itself to manage those particular projects. Where we are right now is we're at the confluence of three significant things that are happening. And the first one is we are at the tail end of launching our new environmental and social framework, which will become effective in early 2026, replacing the current safeguard policy statement, which has been in effect since 2009. Secondly, we've just processed our first mining project for a good number of years. As I say, it's a re-engagement in this particular space, and that namely is the Reko Diq copper gold project in Balochistan, Pakistan. And there are lessons that, you know, we can take from that and hopefully discuss in today's session. And the third point is probably the most fundamental or important point is the new direction paper that's being produced by ADB, which is our our critical minerals to manufacturing in the value chain direction paper, which is essentially a strategy that guides us over the next 5 years in the intervention points where ADB will support our DMCs and private sector clients operating in DMCs to engage with mining. So the RECO-DIC project is sort of couched within that critical mineral strategy document, and it sits as a single sort of project. But while we look at some broader issues around that and other potential projects moving forwards, so there's lots of space to sort of think through how we use that as the foundation for moving forwards, which kind of is a nice segue into some of the discussion points that will probably come up through this session. In terms of your specific question, obviously, as I said, we've had lots of experience and engagement with huge projects with huge environmental and social impacts, like hydropower projects come with their own very complex issues that touch on a lot of the points that mining do in terms of land acquisition and displacement, impacts on indigenous peoples or vulnerable communities, biodiversity impacts, waste management, so on and so forth. But I think what situates mining as a particularly unique sort of initiative is, as you say, it sort of what sets us apart. It sets it apart is this need for us to come to terms with the regional impacts, the sort of ripple effect of a mining project that allows it to sort of sustain itself in a particular socioeconomic environment. So yeah, and I think, as I say, the strategy paper that we've developed, I hope allows that with our experience in things like regional planning, new environmental and social safeguards framework should place us quite well, I think, for managing some of these complex issues.
So I don't obviously know the safeguards as well as you do, but when I looked at it recently, it talks about establishing, when you're looking at your environmental and social impacts, it talks about establishing boundaries. So identifying your management boundaries, and you've got to have some sort of a scope. um, um, how does that accommodate, or does it yet accommodate, um, the regional approach? Because I guess it's not just about the truism that there's going to be impacts outside the fence. It's about who takes responsibility for that, and if you measure it, you're likely to be asked to manage it. And maybe drawing on what's happened in Pakistan and yeah, and how this is evolving conceptually as well as practically.
Yeah, thanks, Ashton. I mean, I don't think I'm going to say anything controversial or innovative if I stress the importance of the environmental and social impact assessment in terms of identifying the direct, indirect, induced, and cumulative impacts, which guide the development of those documents. But I think there's a lot to be said for how well that's done. And I think it's important to have the right kind of team on board to do that. So that in essence, in some shape or form, constitutes the sort of boundaries, so to speak. And that's where the safeguards requirements come to play in terms of establishing the boundary to the impacts of a particular project. So if there's a causal link, and it's a core kind of causal link where there's a direct relationship that can be managed, and that should be managed by the client, then that's where we would draw the boundary. It does obviously become a little bit more nuanced when you talk about induced impacts and cumulative impacts, where on the edges, whether that's a sort of spatial sort of thing, you bring to bear or bring to the table other stakeholders that should help manage those particular issues. And we look at things like the popular one like influx management or natural resource management. The flow of people into a particular area looking for work, which is a very common characteristic of large scale mining, especially in areas where the economy is depressed. That's where there's a sort of an engagement between different stakeholders to have responsibilities. I mean, it's quite clear that a project cannot restrict the movement of people across territories, but who does have the responsibility to manage the impacts of that, I think, is where there's some sort of intersectionality that's required from borrowers, together with support from financiers, together with government hosts.
Great, thanks. And Peter, Richard ADB has just begun its path, its journey with the Reko Diq project. I'm sure Rich will be monitoring it, but your experience in the Simandou project is mature, and you've been doing that for quite a while now. Can you tell us a little bit about the Simandou project, this enormous project in Guinea, and how it kind of sat within this regional economic development strategy, which I understood was developed before construction actually began, which feels like it's a little bit different to many other experiences that you might have seen over the 40 years that you've been doing this. But yeah, please tell us a little bit about Simandou.
Yeah, thanks, Ashton, and good morning, good afternoon, good everyone, good evening, everyone. Just a quick disclaimer before I start answering the question, Ashton, is the views I'm expressing here are mine, and they don't necessarily represent any of my clients, and including Rio Tinto. Yeah, so I was brought into the Simandou project initially to lead the project-induced migration program, because in a context like Guinea, and particularly with a mine of this scale, immigration isn't a theoretical social risk, it's an absolute certainty. And I'd seen it repeatedly in many years. I've worked across sub-Saharan Africa, particularly in West Africa. As soon as a large investment like Simandou makes news, and what are we talking about here? We're talking about a major port, deepwater port, 2 large mines, and a 650-kilometer railway that essentially opens up the center of Guinea. As soon as these large investments make news and are committed to, people start migrating. And they move early, they move in large numbers, and often into the project region, which in my experience usually has very limited governance and very limited infrastructure to cope with these kinds of changes. So my first task was an immigration management plan. I would say pretty normal social safeguard tool for any new mine in Africa, Asia, Latin America. But based on what I'd seen before in Guinea, a management plan is never going to be enough. In my experience, projects of the scale of mega projects of the scale of Simandou, they don't, as Richard said, they don't sit neatly within a project boundary with a clear defined edge. Their footprints radiate across a geography, and it could be really hard to know where they really finish. So in my view, you can't treat immigration of people and the rapid urbanization that comes with it as a social risk that you can manage with measures or mitigation measures or design controls. That's never worked like that for me. You know, I'm trained as an urban planner, regional development specialist. For me, people and urbanization are a catalyst for spatial and economic transformation, which I think is essential to share the prosperity that mining and mining companies and governments they promise to deliver this prosperity. So that shift in mindset from risk management to transformation opportunity, that's what led to the decision to embed the immigration plan in a broader regional development strategy, because we weren't trying to manage the change, we were trying to structure it. And timing matters. We already knew that when we knew where the mine would be, we knew where the rail would be, we knew where the port would be. So instead of waiting for problems to emerge, we moved early, and we put in place a regional development strategy 2 years before construction began. And that strategy focused on shaping where opportunity could unfold. For example, through economic clustering and the productive use of land unlocked by the rail. And for me, this is where we flip the usual ESG safeguard model. Most safeguards, in my experience anyway, are about avoiding, minimizing, mitigating, and that's fine. There's a role to play, but in my view, it was never enough in a mining project. And what I thought we needed was a strategy that could unlock the opportunities within a spatial economy. So, for example, the new mining infrastructure at Simandou meant that people could travel from the remote center of Guinea to the coast in 8 hours instead of 8 days. So let's just think about the opportunities that unlocks. That's transformative. So we weren't trying just to protect people from negative impacts. We were trying to unlock the positive ones: economic diversification, new businesses, new industries, new productive uses of land. And to the question about what we learned, Ashton, for me, the core lesson was that timing and framing matters the most. The decision to operationalize an immigration plan 2 years before construction and embed it in a broader regional development strategy, that for me proved decisive. No other mining project had done this before, in my view, and it allowed us to firstly flatten the immigration curve. And that meant before the exponential growth started, and this meant that we could get manageable levels of growth compared to the prefecture of Bokeh in northwest Guinea, which had 20% year-on-year population growth in the region. So I think this outcome validated the core principle, prepare, not repair, at a regional level. And I think we should perceive social dynamics like immigration as a positive economic force and design for it regionally from the start, to stop chasing impacts and start shaping outcomes. And that shift from, reactive management to proactive enabling, that for me was probably the most important decision that was made.
Excellent. I'll come back to some of those points on incentives and role of safeguards and sort of the mine of the future. But just sticking with the regional economic development framework, and in the spirit of transmitting knowledge on how to do these things, getting very practical here, who actually wrote the regional economic development framework? I mean, it sounds as though that should be a government-led thing. And how scalable is it? Rio Tinto obviously, and this project is a mega project with many resources behind it. Can we expect that all projects will have this lovely contextual framework in which to locate and position the impacts of its project?
Yeah, okay. Ashton, that's a great question. So the regional development strategy was facilitated originally by Rio Tinto, deliberately so. And that was a mandate from the executive committee of Rio Tinto. So, and the reason was that in a context like Guinea, where the governance is relatively weak or the state is not really absent, we needed some sort of scaffolding, some sort of framework within which we could operate. But you go to the point, you mentioned the point, mining companies are not proxy authorities. They shouldn't be proxy authorities. On the other hand, when you're operating in regional parts of sub-Saharan Africa, where almost all mines are being developed, you then have to accept the reality that the state wants to be present, but simply can't, it just can't be. So in my view, the mine of the future, it will have a regional development strategy as part of its ability, as part of its development process. You could argue, well, isn't it the government's responsibility? Yes. And governments eventually, particularly in Guinea, they now have a strategy in place, which wasn't in place when we started. And so the job in those cases for mining companies is to realign the strategy. It needs to be flexible enough to realign with the stated government priorities. And, that's why I call it a scaffold, temporary scaffold. We needed something to help us structure immigration. And the regional development strategy was a way to do that. And then eventually the responsibility for that is taken over by the government. And that's already happening in Guinea. But, for me, the reason why we connected immigration is because immigration means that you have this influx of people, which I think is a good thing They bring capital, they start businesses, they deliver services, they trade goods, they lead to urbanization. Urbanizations are the engines of any economy. It's how information spreads, how labor and finds capital, how demand meets supply. So in that sense, immigration is a very positive feature. It's not a bug to be fixed, but it can't be done. It can't be managed in an absence, in a vacuum of broader national policy. And that's why I would say to any mining company and any government looking at projects the scale of Simandou or even smaller, is that in the future we need to have the management of social dynamics needs to be in a broader regional development framework, a landscape level approach. Thanks, Ashton.
So Sally, the influx of people, Peter has said, can be a very positive thing in terms of economic development, but it doesn't necessarily seem to be a good thing for forests and nature. So I guess let me ask the question, is mining compatible with biodiversity conservation? I think you're on mute, Sally.
Ashton, hi, and thank you so much for inviting me. And like others, I'm really excited to talk about this topic. I could, bore for Britain on this for days on end. So absolutely, and so the first thing I want to say on this issue is that therapists say you've got to recognise your problem before you solve it, and I do think that the narrative has been for a very long time that agricultural dwarfs mining, and globally, of course, that's still very true. But mining is a growing driver of loss, and there is, as we referred to before, this halo around mines, which several papers like Sonta, Forest Smart Mining in the World Bank, and a more recent paper the other day, does talk about 50 to 70 kilometer halo, and in-migration is part of that. And Peter's absolutely right. This catalyst is the catalyst for regional growth, unlocks opportunities and economic diversification. But as we know, in places where perhaps we don't have strong land use planning, or we don't have a Peter or government who's formulated a regional land use plan, it catalyzes large-scale biodiversity loss. And we need to, as your therapist would say, recognize that and move on from the narrative of, look, aren't we so much better than agriculture? And then, taking partial responsibility for that, and not saying, okay, well, I don't have control over everything in the landscape, and I don't want to have liability issues, and therefore I'm going to stick within the fence line. You have to recognize that you're part of that causal chain, and with influence comes accountability. And one of the kind of second things that we need to do, apart from recognizing the problem from a biodiversity perspective, is accounting for it. And we can talk later about the safeguards and when they refer to indirect and cumulative effect, what do they really mean by that? But it's quite rare to see companies account for indirect impacts as part of their residual impact assessment. And unless we do that, that's the starting point before we talk about collaboration with partners.
So that shift in responsibility, to me, that conceptually sounds good, and it's sort of thing I might say. But if you're telling that to a manager and say, you now got to take responsibility for things outside your fence line, how do you do that? And they'll say, well, I've got a contract, I've got an agreement with the government, I've got agreement with my investors, you want to put more on my plate. It's funny enough, I was listening here at LME Week in London, and I was listening to the CEO of Vale Gustavo Pimenta, and they have a project in Para State in Brazil. And he was saying how contractually they have to look after 850,000 hectares of land there, and the governor is so pleased with how they're exercising control over that piece of real estate that they want them to expand their might and take on an additional 1 million hectares and manage it for conservation objectives. But that's in a contract. That's an agreement between the mine and the province. So practically, going back to this idea of practically, how do you convince and what do you say to these mine managers that this is going to now be part of their management interest?
I think increasingly companies are recognizing that. I think you make the next step of ensuring that that's accounted for. Once you've accounted for that, what you then have to do something about the bit that you've accounted for. So if your residual impact says, instead of 1,000 hectares, I'm now responsible for addressing, I'm just making it up, but 5,000, 10,000 hectares, then once you've applied the mitigation hierarchy, you then need to address that. And what does that mean? That means collaborating on conservation within the wider area. I mean, there's all sorts of other things we could talk about here, but for example, the World Bank is working with the government of Guinea to expand the protected area network. And the way they're setting it up, capacity building with the Conservation Trust Fund, this then enables companies, the private sector, to contribute, whether it's a sort of nature positive initiative or whether it's through an obligation through their need to offset those hectares. They have a much, the enabling framework has been developed around them, which makes this a lot easier. Where, as long as other things are all equal, like for like, etc., the World Bank is facilitating, and the government of Guinea, and enabling that process to be much easier. So my mine manager can say, okay, well, I've got my 5,000 hectares that I need to do something about. This isn't going to be the nightmare that I thought it was. I kind of know where I'm going. I'm focusing on regional priorities. I mean, there are lots of other things that we need to do, but that's one way of making life easier for companies to contribute at a landscape level.
And another way, I think,
go ahead.
And the other way to incentivize them, and coming back to the topic of safeguards and standards, and maybe I'll go in reverse order here, starting with you, Sally, is in biodiversity, in safeguards, there's a history. I mean, I think when I started, it was about minimizing impact on biodiversity. Then it went to no net loss. Then it went to net gain. And then it went to nature positive, which is an expensive way of saying the same thing, I think. But you're working on the ICMM, International Council on Mining Metals Good Practice Guidance, which isn't a standard, it's a guidance. So have ESG safeguards in regards to biodiversity and landscape kept up with what do we call that? Good practice, effective practice, or examples of effective practice, such as we've heard from Peter on the social side in Simandou, and presumably what you're writing in the ICMM guidance.
So look, you've got to give the safeguards the credit that they were talking about, including cumulative and indirects in the area of influence. I think what happened there, they didn't sort of then take it forward. So what do you mean by that? And I think there is a lot of work to do now to say, well, when I say take account of the indirect and cumulative effects, this is what I mean. This is what it could look like, whether that's through guidance or obligation. I'm not sure, but you are right. There is an element where we haven't kept up by just enabling that transition from issues which talk about this to then enabling companies to knowing, so what does that actually mean? What am I responsible for? How do I account for that? And then how do I move from blah, blah into actually action, whether that's regional conservation or designing for permeability is a really, really, we don't talk about that enough. That a lot of these, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, where you're talking about large mammals who migrate, like elephants, or even, chimps have large home ranges. If you don't design regionally for permeability, meaning you've got to be incredibly aware of all this infrastructure, that becomes a barrier, then you are going to come up with significant problems. But one other thing is that it is understanding your area of influence, and of course the safeguards talk about area of influence, but what ICMM and others are talking about is an area of analysis, and that's much more understanding. Okay, I may say, well, I've got the odd elephant wanders through my site here, is really understanding the intersection between those ranges and your operation. And that doesn't mean saying, I saw a chimp the other day. It means understanding the extent, as you referred to, the functional part of ecology within the landscape and how you intersect with that.
I don't want to move on yet until I kind of address the counting and compensation part of it. The chimps is an interesting example because they have summer homes and winter homes, and if you do your analysis, unless you do it over the whole year, you won't see where those homes are. So you have to account for it. But ultimately, there's always going to be some sort of impact. You're not going to be able to go down your mitigation hierarchy and avoid, minimize, and replace everything. So you got an option for offsetting, but we seem to be very coy about offsetting because everyone's terrified that it means they're not going to do their best to address the higher requirements of the mitigation hierarchy. But presumably this has got to have a place nowadays, hasn't it, in biodiversity, as in it does in carbon?
I really fundamentally think that it does. And look, I know there are many out there who are still very, very concerned about offsets. And, they haven't, offsets to date haven't, or many of them haven't, perhaps shone as well as they could. And there are all sorts of issues associated with why that might be the case. But if we, there really is an opportunity, particularly in countries that are unable to finance their conservation, for mining to really contribute to regional and national conservation. I've seen this, I believe it, I know it will work. We just have to ensure that we have the right enabling environment. I was talking about the bank in Guinea. And then we need to implement them correctly with all the right safeguards around that. And that means a lot of work. It means, feasibility studies, just like you would from an engineering perspective, to understand whether you really can deliver something in the right place. But I strongly believe in them.
Excellent. So Peter, Sally was talking then about kind of maximizing conservation outcomes, and you mentioned something similar around looking at mineral development mining as contributing to social and economic impacts as well. So looking at the outcomes, but you also mentioned that, I think without putting words in your mouth, that somehow the ESG safeguards aren't fit for that particular purpose because they're about setting the line for what is acceptable in terms of managing your direct impact. You've got Richard here who's managing the ADB safeguards. How would you advise him to incorporate some of these things? Because if it gets into a standard, into a safeguard, then it becomes compulsory. What you were doing was with Rio Tinto and Simandou was out of a sense of social responsibility and winning a license to operate. But how do we codify that into something which is more reliable in terms of being implemented?
Yeah, thanks, Ashton. And look, that's something that I've been thinking about for a long time because I've been operating under particularly the IFC performance standards for 15 years. I should say up front, I'm not an expert in environmental and social and governance safeguards. You know, my role as a practitioner has always been to work with them, to comply with them, implement them, or try to align with them. But this is my personal view. They're written by environmental and social management specialists for specialists, and they focus, they seem to me anyway, defining and mitigating direct project impacts, which makes perfect sense at a asset level when you've got, as you said before, Ashton, a dot rather than a region. But they never really translated, it never really helped me at the regional level work. And I've explained why I need to work at the regional level. And if you go into most places in sub-Saharan Africa where mines are, usually regional areas, governance is weak or in most cases completely absent. So, you know, and the reason for that is, or the dynamic that we're dealing with is that mining companies are fast, they move fast, they move much faster than institutional capacity of a government can evolve. So you get this massive gap or vacuum. But in my view, the performance standards or a lot of the things that I've written or that I've read or used in my work haven't given me the advice that I needed. So I ended up leaning very heavily on the OECD's Mining Regions and Cities Initiative. So that's not a safeguard system. It's advice. It doesn't have compliance indicators or monitoring, but it gave me a very practical spatial planning framework. It helped me think about the trade-offs between development, conservation, connectivity, and how mining investment reshapes economic geography. You know, I'm not saying that the current set of ESG safeguards don't work. I do think they're essential, and they do provide discipline and standards, and they have improved a lot over the time. And we mentioned the new biodiversity offset guidance, which Sally's involved with. You know, that acknowledges regional scale and cumulative impacts and dealing with them that matter. But, and forgive me, I just had a quick look at it. It doesn't yet provide the tools to operate at a regional scale. So there's a general awareness of the issue. So in order to, so what did I do in Guinea? You know, for me, there must be a third way. The safeguards still need to do what they're meant to do, but they need to be augmented by the spatial planning principles by frameworks like the OECD initiative. For me, that would be really useful to see safeguards, not for me as static requirements, but something a bit more flexible that can scale with complexity. They can adapt to the institutional realities that people like me find on the ground and support regional transformation. I think, you know, for me, I think that's the way to go. Thanks, Ashton.
So, Richard, in some ways, the Asian Development Bank's in a unique position because it has safeguards for its private sector and public sector investments, but it's also has a development agenda. And are we not talking about kind of two sides of a coin here? One is about making sure that investments are accountable for the impacts that they might have and those mitigated, but also there's the development agenda, which might not be the same. So are the safeguards the appropriate thing to look at, or should we be looking at other instruments as well, as Peter mentioned, and other modalities in the bank to complement when you're investing into these large projects?
Yeah, thanks, Ashton. Yeah, I think you've just answered your question. I think, you know, and this, as I say, is where ADB's critical minerals directive comes into play. Where we situate certain private sector investments, such as a mining project or a manufacturing asset or something else within the value chain, that can be supported through an enabling, whether it's a regular enhancement and capacity building at a regulatory level, or whether it's capacity building stakeholders at a governance level, or whether it's bringing into play or crowding in other stakeholders who might facilitate that process. So I think the safeguards has a role to play, as I think has been sort of agreed in this discussion. There's some blurry bits on the edge about where project accounting, as you might call it, or impacts are managed and how those responsibilities are defined. And then there's the stuff on the outside which constitutes the greater part of the landscape, you might say, which is where there might be a multitude of different stakeholders that would participate. And as you rightly say, it's that complementarity between which ADB can bring to bear, and I'm sure other financing institutions as well, to work in that space. I think just the additional point I would make though is the time factor in this, and in my experience, I've worked with some really well-intentioned companies that look at these sort of transformational projects on a regional basis, and go in with the right intentions and sometimes at the right time as well, years in advance of when financial close or construction might commence. But often the resourcing behind it is sometimes lacking, and political will to engage in the process as well until certain agreements are signed, or that people are really understand that things are going to start moving. A lot of governments obviously operate in this space where there have been lots of promises on projects that are going to go to construction, and then it's delayed and delayed and delayed. So everyone, it's also a sector of that's faced with a lot of uncertainty as well. So it's trying to operate on a long term to put in place the right kind of frameworks, institutional capacity, the infrastructure on the ground to make all these things work, educating the people to the right level, all those sorts of things. They take time, they take resources. For the most part, a lot of these jurisdictions, they just don't have that. So I think the complementarity is there. I think there's a lot of will there, but there are lots of bits missing to make this, to operationalize a lot of these well-intentioned issues.
Yeah, you're right. And I also, I think what I heard from Peter and Sally's experience, and I'm sure yours as well, is that safeguards or no safeguards, if they want the project to go ahead, they need to win this license to operate for the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And that's something they have to take on themselves and figure out. Do you think that license to operate should actually be a topic that we can bring into the analysis of these projects? Could it somehow be incorporated into the family of instruments that the ADB uses to assess and monitor projects?
So a comparative bank, so let's say the IFC, they have this broad stakeholder consent approach, which informs how they process deals. ADB doesn't have that. The only time we have any kind of consent as a sort of synonym for license is when we deal, or when we have projects which trigger our indigenous peoples standards, where we have FPIC, and that's only triggered under specific conditions as well. It's a difficult one to answer. I mean, is it on ADB to sort of prevent individual or private entities from going ahead with a particular project if there's a large amount of contest or protest? We would look at that as an ADB, as part of the ADB advisory team. We would look at that and we would say, this is, even though from a safeguards perspective, we think the project has the capacity to manage these, and we think the ESI is robust or whatever. But in the context of large-scale protests, we would raise that as a significant red flag for our management team. We don't work with the social license to operate. I think that's a complex issue. I think of late it's sort of fraught with different kinds of interpretations and challenges in terms of what it connotes in terms of who has the power to authorize projects. And there are people have different kind of agenda in terms of supporting a project or not. So, yeah, I mean, it's challenging. I mean, from a safeguards perspective, we don't really look at social license to operate. I'm not sure how useful it is, to be frank, but I'd be interested to hear other opinions on that.
Well, that's good. Now, there's a few questions coming in now, which are not unrelated to this, and a couple here for Peter, one from my friend Anne-Marie Fleury at Glencore. She says, you stated it's important, Peter, that getting the frame established early. I think even you said, a couple of years before you even kind of start construction is important. So that's great when you've got a greenfield site. But how about the mines which are already in existence, and the mine manager there, the company, the operator is facing immigration, which is already there. It's already present. And I'll just put another one onto that as well, is that government is presumably extremely important at this, but where government is absent, again, that question, how do you get them engaged early and whose responsibility is that? So two questions there, the sort of legacy, not quite legacy mines, but existing mines and immigration. How do you get that into a framework? And again, on the government.
Actually, I think technically that's three questions, Ashton, but I'll have a bash at all three. Look, what's informed the approach at Simandou is the issues that I've faced in exactly these circumstances when I've been involved in a project, when I tried to get the regional development strategy up and running before construction, and that advice, for one reason or the other, was not followed, or working on a project when the recognition that immigration had become such a problem, then a regional development strategy was needed. And so that they're very strong drivers to the approach that was taken in Simandou, because I know what works and I know what doesn't work. When it comes to a project which has been operating, a project that may be around for 15, 20 years, and they're operating, and the development patterns around the mine have become chaotic and difficult, that can be fixed. But I have to say, in my experience, it takes you 10 to 20 times longer. The costs of resolving issues takes a long, long time. And essentially, what you need is small incremental efforts by everyone involved to keep going year after year. So it's difficult, almost. The issues are intractable. So I haven't really found a clear way of resolving it, other than you need to do something, and you could put some things in place. For example, in Bokeh, population increases triggered the need for a development strategy. We put one in place that's been in by the government. That's been in place now for 5 or 6 years. It's slowly having some impact, but it's painfully slow. I think that what I have found in some circumstances where there's an absence of structure, an absence particularly of community participation, is that you just really need to start working at bottom level and work your way up, and then hopefully the government comes down, then you meet somewhere in the middle. So the projects that I think have worked well for me is when you organize communities to participate in the project at a very local level. You bring in traditional, non-traditional leaders, and then what I've found is that the positive aspects of what you're doing starts flowing upwards to ministry level in the capital, and then there's a meeting in the middle. But if anyone on this call is a mining executive, and you're considering putting a mine in place or developing mine in sub-Saharan Africa or Latin America, if you're doing it in the absence of a regional development strategy, then what you're creating for yourself are legacy issues that will last for many, many years. I'm sorry I don't have the silver bullet for existing projects, other than 10 to 20 years of incrementally trying to resolve it. Ashton.
Maybe we'll have silver buckshot. I've got one more question for you, Peter. Richard, there's a question there for you on ADB in Indonesia, which I'll come to in a second. But Peter, just thinking about kind of the mine of the future, we're seeing now more and more mines being automated, some of them like 70% automated. And so that I think in the future means the presence on the ground is going to be less, and there are going to be fewer opportunities for employment. So what does that mean for influx management and your idea that we can change the reputation of mining through driving local economic development?
That's a very good question. So the premise of the regional development strategy is not reliance on local content or the mine itself. The idea is economic diversification. Mining infrastructure unlocks opportunities, access to land, urbanization. Urbanization means people come in with money, capital, creates businesses, but the diversification means that you don't want to rely on the mine. I mean, mines don't really employ very many people once they're up and operating. And they're going to be employing fewer and fewer people. So if you're a national government expecting a large mine to transform your economy through its local content or goods and services flowing from the mine, it's not going to happen. However, I mean, it will happen in the sense of taxes and royalties, and that's very, very important. But for the people on the ground, for them, the economic diversification is, industrial agricultural projects, new incubator businesses and goods and services that can now be linked better to markets. That's where the true value and more sustainable value is going to come from. Certainly a economic ecosystem relying on the mine is going to be great until the mine closes, and then what happens? Certainly it's not sustainable. I just want to mention one quick last comment. It's true that mining companies can move quickly because they're driven by profit. So which is absolutely fine. How does the government keep up in places like sub-Saharan Africa? Well, my experience is that they can't, and therefore you always have this gap between how fast mining companies move and how quickly the government can work, the national government can catch up. That always takes, in my experience, a number of years. So what you have to do in the meantime is you have to really focus at the prefectural or regional local level, and you have to enable communities to organize themselves, not tell them what to do, but to organize themselves. And some really good success in as far as that's concerned. So they can be scaled up quickly, actually, within months, which is really difficult at national level. And then eventually the two move closer to each other. And as we now have in Guinea, for example, there's a meeting of minds, what should happen at national and local level. Thanks, Ashton.
Great, thanks. And we're going just to remind all our audience, we're going till 15 minutes past the hour. Richard, I don't know if you had a chance to look at that question, but it seems to have a double edge there. One is around ADB obviously has its own safeguards, but looking at are there other international standards you take into account, and in particular, those which apply to different phases of the supply chain, so not just the mine.
Yeah. So yeah, thanks. Yeah, I did have a quick look at it. There are each project within the value chain would be reviewed and assessed on its own basis, project by project. Of course, where we see some benefit in those linkages, then of course, that's something we'd also explore. But each part would be broken into its constituent elements in terms of financing, because of how financing arrangements are made and for the repayment on the loan. In terms of the standards that are used, I mean, just to jump ahead and let's assume this is something that happens over the next few years, then of course it would be ADB's new environmental and social framework that's applicable. What we're currently doing at the moment, so within the ESF, there's also reference to the application of GIP or good industry practice, and voluntary standards as well, whichever client might be adhering to, and other sorts of covenants that the national government might also be adhering to as well, whether or not it's a signatory to that particular agreement. So there's a sort of a mixed space there. But what we're actually doing under the CMM, under the Critical Minerals Directive, is we're currently exploring, or we're setting out to explore what within the minerals value chain, what the kind of best practices are. So when we say GIP, what does that mean? Which has drawn the best experience and examples within the sector that also meet ADB's particular requirements when it comes to environmental and social safeguards. So we're seeing how they can fit together, and also how industry might receive those particular types of standards too. So it's the space that we're exploring at the moment, and it's it's an interesting space as well, because obviously there are a lot of standards out there, and what we're trying to do is identify within that particular value chain for that particular commodity what works best and what enhances the environmental and social safety. So we're looking for enhancements that would go beyond ADB's requirements.
That's great. Sally, a couple of questions here for you. I think one, I'm going to try and put them together again. How do you count for biodiversity, positive biodiversity impacts at mining? What's the currency, if you want, that can be used? It's not like carbon counting. And how mature is that calculation? And then the question from the audience here is slightly adapted by me, is if we can show that mining companies can have a positive impact on conservation, so it can leave a conservation legacy by virtue of their controls and the economic development that they stimulate around the mine, for example, that doesn't impact on conservation, why shouldn't mining fall underneath sustainable finance?
Great questions. Right, first of all, so I want to separate out accounting for your residual impacts, so the impacts that you've not managed to avoid. And there's an awful lot of work now being done on those metrics. It's really, really important to stress on that. So first of all, earlier I said we do need to account for some of those indirects. So let's make sure we do that. And the second thing is to make sure that accounting is done properly. So, habitat extent and condition is often very, suffice for a lot of things. But I think we have to recognise that species metrics are incredibly important in certain contexts. So I want to see the proper accounting. And if we're talking about positive contributions, and presumably you're referencing the things that are separate to your obligations that you're doing it. So, for example, under ICMM's nature positive initiatives, things like that, you can account for those too in very similar ways, looking at metrics, looking at whether you say it's a conservation project. There are many ways of looking at not just state, so the state of nature within your conservation project, but how you could have a look at pressure metrics. So what measures have you put in place? How many ranges or how much money, and therefore, and have your pressures reduced? So if it was X loss, if your background rate of loss was X, what is it now? How many snares have you removed? How many, there are lots of pressure state response metrics that we can come up that really help us evaluate how much we've contributed on a regional basis. Metrics are another fascinating topic, perhaps for another discussion. Oh, and your question on sustainable financing. I haven't actually worked with anybody who's done this, but I understand, I think Tech Resources Didn't they execute a 4 billion sustainability linked credit facility around various aspects? And as my understanding is that price paid by tech goes up or down depending on their performance. I think it's a really interesting idea.
Well, I mean, if it can be shown that mining companies can actually leave a positive legacy, economically and socially, as Peter has ambitions to demonstrate, and if we can show that there's a positive conservation dividend left behind from mining at decommissioning and closure, then why shouldn't this be in the green taxonomy of the EU and the UK and others as being a positive part of a portfolio rather than one where you just have to minimize the risks? I think that's the kind of the heart of the question. And I would say, well, if we can push it in that direction, that might incentivize both the safeguards and the positive development outcomes that we've been talking about today at the regional scale.
As long as it doesn't go into sort of the general pocket and you have really clear KPIs and you can demonstrate those, then I think it's a wonderful idea.
Great. Well, unfortunately, I think we're just coming up to the end of our time together, but maybe I could just give you, a 30-second response to this question: what is the mine of the future in the context of regional developments and the spatial economy from your perspective, Sally?
Gosh, that's going to be first. 10 seconds. I want governments to put in the enabling environment, which would enable the mine of the future to not only not only manage its own impacts within the fence line, but positively, first of all, account for those in the landscape and positively contribute at a landscape level. There you go.
Fantastic. Peter, the mind of the future you've been working 40 years to demonstrate is now in the present.
Yeah, I wouldn't say I've found the answer yet, Ashton. Look, I think for me, there has to be a better way for getting local and regional communities to participate more proactively and for their benefit in the mining sector. It's not just the mining company's responsibility. I think it's also national government's responsibility. But I think the mine of the future will have a much better way of integrating what local and district communities need, so they get immediate prosperity from mining rather than having to wait a generation. If we can move that prosperity from a generation to months and years, I think both mining companies and communities would be much happier with each other.
Fantastic. And appropriately, as the co-host of this webinar, ADB's Dr. Richard Sherrington, what is the mine of the future for the ADB?
I can't really. I'm not being given the script on that one, so I'm not. I don't have mandate to say that. But from it's a tough one. I mean, I completely echo what my colleagues on the panel are suggesting in terms of creating the right enabling environment, ensuring that benefits are localized to the extent possible, so that there's a good sort of interface between project and local communities and the area in general. I would like to add on to that, though, some sort of green credentials to the project as well, to make sure that mining is done in a greener way in terms of the sort of GHG emissions it produces at waste management, pollution. I think that's a mine of the future.
Wonderful. Well, we've come right to the end of the time, and I've pushed it right to the last minute, so I haven't got time to sort of sum up what has been a very interesting topic. I can see in the Q&A box that many people are asking for a follow-up session, either individually or through one of these webinars or a podcast. So I'm sure that will happen. So it leaves me just to thank you all, Sally, Peter, and Richard, for taking time out of your day to speak on this very interesting topic, and for me, it leaves all sorts of possibilities for mineral development and regional sustainable and economic development, which I hope will be realized. For the audience, we will follow up. Everybody who registered will get a follow-up email and a link to the recording of this. There are also some additional resources which you can see on the screen now. And you can also contact TDI and go onto our webinar and podcast channels to look at all the other resources that we have. But thank you all for joining us today, and we will see you at the next one.